one time when there was lights flying through the second floor
when we did
of the house, and there was banging on the front door.
Like a child going to a horror movie. You go with the expectation of the hope that you're going to
There are stories like that all over town. The Peyton Randolph house has more than, I think, probably than any other.
You're home during the winter and you turn on TV because you're off the next day, and there's a program, the most haunted houses in America, and this is #1.
Peyton Randolph building is arguably the most haunted house in Williamsburg. So there's one house that I choose not to stand in front of for a long time or spend the night in, it would be that one building.
Anybody want to knock on the door? Come on. Actually, I did it once and something knocked back.
Most people are just curious. People like to hear of discovery of treasure. Well, treasure and ghosts and things like that are all somewhere beyond our ken, just outside our experiences, so therefore those sort of things attract people.
The outside ghost tour is really embellished, and I guess trying to scare people, but that's their job, storytelling.
People get into it. It's one of the little subcultures here, you know, and it's kind of fun for those few who choose to do it. It's a neat night activity and a different way to look at what's a lot of fife and drums by day.
The ghosts in the buildings have their way of grabbing people's attention, and so really we get them started. But once we get into our ghost stories and we take them downtown, the town itself takes over, and so we just have to merely tell the stories and point things out, but the town tells its own story, and that's what grabs the people really.
As a writer, I can only write about so many footsteps in the attic or on the stairs without getting repetitious real fast, so what I try to do is seek the unusual phenomena.
Unlike the other places in Williamsburg, which mostly have like one celebrity ghost or one story or one happening or one dark incident that makes the house kind of notorious, the Peyton Randolph house was struck with bad luck for its residents time and time again. It seals the deal by being the house that not only has bad things that have been happening to its families back in the colonial period, but has also plagued colonial Williamsburg employees, supposedly, since it became a property of the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation and more of a historical educational site.
Now, some of the people that work there say when they're downstairs, they hear kids running around upstairs.
Another woman saw a woman bending over a chest, and she disappeared. Another person smelt perfume on a couple of occasions when there was nobody there.
They'll hear a big thump and glass breaking, and they're sure one of the big mirrors has come down. So they get the dustpan and the broom, because you can't have shards of glass all over the floor when tourists are walking through. They go upstairs, nothing has broken, nothing has fallen. We have no idea what's going on.
The janitors at night, you want to interview the janitors, say they don't want to go there.
I think part of its power resides in the fact that its stories have ranged since the beginning of the house up until 10 years ago, and there are still people who are freaked out and security guards who won't go near it.
Randolph, and this portion of the house that you have seen and are standing in at this point was built in 1717. They move into the house when Peyton is 3 years old. He actually inherits it at the age of 16, but his mother has life rights to the house.
We're interpreting the site to how it appeared at the very end of Peyton Randolph's life, which was close to 1775. And it works real nice with the current interpretation of the town, which is trying to deal with the town around the time of the Revolutionary War.
When Peyton Randolph marries young Elizabeth Harrison and they start their life as a married couple, Mr. Randolph's mother would still be living here in this house. She's got life rights to the house. So in the 1750s, he's the Attorney General, and a couple of things happen. His mother dies, and we make the decision that, unlike what we thought we would do when the Capitol building burned down, we are not moving the capital city out of Williamsburg. So you see a big building boom occur here in the capital city, and Peyton Randolph is no exception. He puts an addition onto the house, so he adds this addition on in the 1750s. Also for that reconstructed kitchen that you're going to see, he expands the kitchen to that size at that point, puts a covered walkway connecting it to the house.
It is the only building in town where it is connected like this with a covered walkway. I think it was really more architectural than anything else. It serves to lend two big buildings together to make them look, you know, like one bigger building.
And actually adds on a couple more outbuildings out in the backyard area as well. So right prior to the Revolution, Peyton Randolph is Speaker of the House of Burgesses, so #2 man in the Virginia government, mediator of the debate up there at the Capitol. 1774, he's one of the delegates we'll send to the Continental Congress, and when he gets there, they unanimously elect him as President of the Congress. Fall of 1775, he's there in Philadelphia attending a meeting of the Congress, and unfortunately Mr. Randolph will suffer a stroke while he's up there. Within a couple of hours, he's dead at the age of 54.
Now, while Peyton Randolph was alive, he's the most important political figure in Virginia, sort of the governor, which made Mrs. Randolph sort of the First Lady of Virginia. And then he dies. What's her life going to be like now? What's going to happen to all the dinner parties that went on here? The political discussions that went on here.
They're going to cease.
Yeah, basically it's going to be she and her niece Betsy, who will be living here, and some relatives visiting back and forth. But her life is going to change dramatically.
So no children, no heir. He gives her the house. So Mrs. Randolph is going to take over one of the roles as a femme sole. She can now enter into contracts, she can sue, and she can be sued. 27 enslaved men, women, and children here on this property. She will own the majority. 3 plantations outside of town, 82 slaves split up between those 3 plantations. He gives her life rights to all of that property. So on the eve of the Revolution, she's running this house and 3 plantations and making the decisions on how you best utilize the labor of over 100 people to keep yourself financially afloat in this city.
3 cheers for the Continental Army and for our allies, the French. Hip hip. Huzzah! Hip hip. Huzzah! Hip hip. Huzzah!
We were taking some guesses as to what she could be doing to make money for herself, but she doesn't die with a lot of debt, and she doesn't die until after the surrender of Yorktown. So she was all the way through the war.
I like the way she saw the problem of arguments over inheritance. She said, sell everything, divide the money up among my heirs the way I stipulated.
So much has happened in this state. There's been trauma, there's been bloodshed. But I think because we go back so much further with probably a lot more history, that may be one of the reasons, plus all the trauma, like I say, that's occurred in the state over the centuries, that probably is one of the reasons why we may have as many, if not more, ghosts than others.
Now, Miss Peachy showed up about, 100 years later in the next century. She came in the house with a whole bunch of peachy kids, and she had one little peachy boy that drove her crazy. He climbed trees, and he wouldn't be careful. He climbed high every day, and every day she warned him, don't climb so high, but he did. And sure enough, one day her worst fears came to pass. him up ever so gently and brought him into the house. Now, where does a dear-loving mama put her child that's not feeling so well? In her bed, because kids feel better when they can be in mama's bed or granny's bed or auntie's bed. She put him in her bed in the red oak panel bedroom. And she stayed with him day and night, but the injuries were so severe that he did pass away. Now, she's got a whole house full of peachy kids, but she's got that empty place in her heart. And by this time, the Civil War is over and we have orphans. She found a little boy who needed a home. She brought him into her home, into her heart, adopted him, raised him up as her very own, and got him all ready to go to the College of William and Mary. But guess what? Just as he was about to go to school, he got tuberculosis. So where did that dear mama put him? In her bed, you guessed it, in the red oak panel bedroom. What do you think the outcome was? It wasn't positive, folks. He died. So, as I say, I don't want to spend the night in that bedroom, but maybe you do.
By the time that Peachy got the house at the end of the century, the place was probably in pretty good shape. Peachy is a buddy of St. George Tucker. He moves here to Williamsburg, I think it may be in 1796 or so, sort of late in the 1790s, about the same time that St. George Tucker is working on his house. And a lot of work had already been done on the house before he got it. It's built in the 17-teens, and so you know, the house was starting to get old at this point, but some changes were made to it in the middle of the 18th century, work that Peyton Randolph had done. His wife Betty, after his death, had made some improvements to the house, I think in preparation for selling it. She died before she could sell it, and then Joseph Hornsby got the property, and he sort of revamps it at that time, modernizes it a little bit, redoes the outbuildings. And when Peachy gets it, Peachy's a lot older than his wife Mary, and dies very shortly after coming to Williamsburg. And she seems to be in need of money after his death and turns the house into a boarding house.
There was a man who visited this house, and he actually stayed a few nights. And you know, he paid him money to stay here for a few nights, and he shot himself. He killed himself right in front of the fireplace. And so when the kids were walking by, they saw a man standing there with his hand on the wall, looking down to the fireplace.
Mary Peachy's son runs off to California in '49 trying to make it rich in the finding gold. Doesn't, so he comes back, and I think when he comes back, he cleans up the outside of the house. He's replacing a lot of the siding, and he puts this addition on the back that becomes the kitchen. And so that external kitchen is redundant by this time, and it's not long after that that it gets torn down. If you strip out all of the 19th century changes to the house, you're still left with a building that looks kind of 80% the way it did when Peyton Randolph was here in the middle of the 18th century.
I had a school group from West Virginia, and I was real happy about that because I'm from West Virginia originally. They were 5th graders, and it was cold. It was February a year ago, and it was windy. I told the story as quick as I could because we were all freezing. And one of the little girls had a Polaroid camera. So after I told this story, she said, "Could you take a picture of the door?" And I said, "Sure." So she took 2 pictures of the door, and we stood under the street light and watched the first picture develop. And well, she was kind of disappointed because she said it just looked like big old cat eyes. But then we got to the bus, and the second picture had developed. And there's a woman standing in the picture. She's standing in the doorway. And right at her knees is a big black cat. Now, she has the most beautiful shawl on I've ever seen. It doesn't have fringe, doesn't have ruffles, but it's got embroidery, and you could see the embroidery went over her shoulder. I went around checking who this woman might be, and all the really, really old guys in town say, "No question, it's Mrs. Peachy." And I said, "Well, how do you know it's Miss Peachy?" And they could be teasing me or they could be serious. But evidently, whenever Mrs. Peachy's missing her children and there are kids out here that she wants to be with, she'll come out on the porch. And guess what she had? A big black cat. It was so big it was legendary here. So I'm happy with it being Mrs. Peachy. They tell me I'm on her good list, but some of the guides on our ghost tour can't keep their candles lit down here. And they know they're not on Mrs. Peachy's good list.
So how would either of you feel about spending the night in the Randolph house?
I would not.
I would not either. I would not be the least bit interested.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be a fun thing to do.
Oh, I'd like to spend the night there. It'd be real nice.
Once upon a time, 3 years ago, I looked into the very basics of attempting to do just that.
I don't go that close to the Randolph building. I don't go any closer than we went today.
I've been in several bed and breakfasts and hotels where the certain room was supposedly haunted, and I spent the night there, and I'm usually so tired I just fall asleep.
It can become boring in a hurry when nothing happens.
Well, I feel Mrs. Peachy's protection, so I'm okay, but I don't want to spend the night there.
If you end up doing that, I'll go with you.
By the early 20th century, Williamsburg was not as, Williamsburg's importance to the rest of the state, both politically, socially, and economically, had really changed. And this house became a tourist house. It was, not much more than a boarding house. Dr. Goodwin was first here in Williamsburg at the very turn of the 20th century. He was rector of Bruton Parish Church, and he became fascinated with this town and thought that somebody needed to come in here and save these buildings, restore the town, and make something more out of it. And what he did in that first visit was to restore the church. He physically didn't do much more than that. When he returns in the 1920s, he convinced John D. Rockefeller to come down and think about buying the town up, which ultimately he did.
All the structures were privately occupied then, before the historic area. And I remember her saying it was, the green out here, Market Square Green, was like a big yard, and there were so many families with children. It was like a playground. They all knew one another, and there are not many families with young children here now.
The ladies didn't like John D. Rockefeller. He was a Yankee coming down and they thought he was going to destroy their town. And Mrs. Diversa can remember them sitting in the Randolph house and throwing darts at W.A.R. Goodwin's picture and drinking bourbon and grapefruit juice was their drink of the day.
She showed me pictures of her mother. She was a very handsome woman, and I think showed a lot of initiative in buying the Randolph house. You have to wonder whether the house would have been preserved without Mrs. Ball's efforts.
It's clear that the Balls were very much interested and appreciated the history of the place, and that's kind of a reflection of the times too, the interest in the colonial revival, and Mrs. Ball trying to restore the house back to the best of her ability, what the house, she thought the house looked like. I'm not sure it was inevitable the house would have been torn down had she not had the house. I don't know that there was any movement to tear the building down. But she clearly appreciated the place in a way that I don't think you would necessarily expect just anybody who might have happened to own it. She was the one that figured out this was the house of Peyton Randolph, that when the foundation first took over the site, they thought the house was across town. And and she insisted that it was Peyton Randolph's house because of the research she had done, and it was and Clayton Williamsburg finally had to admit that they were wrong and named it the Peyton Randolph house at that time.
I have to tell you a funny story about the Randolph house. When I wrote the chapter, the Virginia Gazette reprinted it in the newspaper. And I had called it a house of tragedy because there'd been a number of suicides in early deaths of infants and so forth in the house over the years, which was documented. And at the time, there was a lady still living there. She gave me a call. She was in her 70s then, and said that I had no right to call it a house of tragedy, that she'd lived there all her life, she'd had a very happy life, and I didn't know what I was talking about.
She was certainly aware that there were the stories about the house and that people were interested in that kind of thing. Most of her stories to me were about growing up there and her fondness for the house as a childhood home and the sentimental value that she attached to it.
She thought it was funny. She thought, in fact, I can remember her telling me she had gone in the house one night and she was standing and waving, and it had freaked everybody out. She kept saying, you know, ghost stories are fun, but they're folklore.
This story was collected by L.B. Taylor Jr. from the last owners of the house, and they were here till 1989. Now, their friend Helen was a school teacher, and probably still is a school teacher, in Richmond, Virginia. And she was invited to a big old fancy wedding down here. And so she was going to spend the weekend with her friends, and they were all going to go to the wedding. And they went to the wedding, went to the reception, came back, and Helen and her friend were sitting talking about things, having a cup of tea, and it was time for bed. And Helen's friend took her upstairs and put her to bed in the most beautiful guest bedroom in the whole house. It's paneled in, you guessed it, red oak.
It was that same night that I came back in July of whatever it was, when I was 16, and very, very hot. And I'm tossing and turning and tossing and turning in bed. I'm hearing what I think is the water lapping against the bulkhead. You hear this, which turned into like breathing. You hear this.
As she's rolling over, she sees her friend, at least she thinks it's her friend, standing at the end of the bed.
I'm awake, but I'm like trying desperately to sleep. And so I'm like groggy and I'm looking, and there is at my doorway a shadow, an outline of a person.
Woman's in a white nightgown and kind of looking at her, and Helen checks it out. It's 2 o'clock, and she's thinking, wonder if everything's okay.
And I remember thinking, blinking as we do it in the middle of the night, thinking that you see something and you figure out what this is. It's like, oh, it's a coat. Oh, I left that there. Or there's something, you know. And I'm thinking, and it's just not changing, and it's still just there. I'm going, oh my God.
So she asks her friend, are you okay? And the woman isn't doing anything. She's not saying anything. She's just looking. Helen said, is everything okay? And the woman starts to make a little move. She's leaning over and she's kind of frowning. She starts wringing her hands, looking real worried.
And I'm thinking, I am not going to be able to tolerate this guy, this being, this whatever this is in front of me, standing at my doorway much longer. So I remember going, and stretching, right, you know, taking all my courage to do this, right? And I actually remember seeing this figure, like, do this strange little movement, and then it floated out of the doorway, and it actually floated downstairs.
Mrs. Ball sold the house to the corporation, and then we restored the house, and she was the life tenant. And then in the late 1960s, we wanted to open this as a museum house, and so they did up this wing of the house, which is a reconstruction, and made this into a residence for them and moved them out of the main part of the house.
That whole side of the house was very, very different. It looked more homey and not stark. There were some antiques in it that were family antiques. She was very open and very warm and very gracious, and you got that sense throughout her house.
In the late 1970s, Colonial Williamsburg became interested in this property again. The restoration that was done in the 1960s was very quick. They wanted to do the minimum they had to get it open as a museum house. And a lot of that had run its course. The bicentennial just happened, so there was renewed interest in the property. And the director of archaeology at that time was Ivor Noel Hume. So he did some test excavations over a 2-year period in the late 70s.
We excavated the 2 wells, one to the south of the building, one to the north, and I nearly got killed in one of them because the bottom fell out when I was standing on it. So I always had an affection for the Wythe House.
The Wythe House is an original building. It is probably the best preserved of the original buildings here in Williamsburg. It's been sitting where you see it for about 251 or 52 years.
Wythe is haunted. I mean, that's one I think most people agree.
Why do you say that?
Well, I mean, that's the only one that has really had things happen when there's been more than one person in the room.
Oh, cool.
In the early 80s, there's kind of a new crop of historians and professionals here at the foundation, and then they sort of built on the interest that, or the buzz that Noel Hume had made in the late 70s. And so by the early to mid 80s, we had started doing some very serious excavations in the backyard and planning for work on the site. We had to tear off the porch tower off the back of the house in order to put the covered way and kitchen up because they didn't coexist. And so we were already affecting the house. I would say there's still more work to do inside the house after this. For the most part, the work is minor. Probably what's more important to the life of a site is the interest and activity that goes along with it than it is sort of doing the job and leaving. I think, you know, as long as we're here fine-tuning stuff and trying to find ways to make the interpretation work with the restoration and trying to make it more accurate and more complete and more complex, I think that'll keep the interest up.
If there is a ghost legend associated with a particular house that's been handed down generation to generation or has been publicized before, I think probably it adds to the attraction.
So are the stories true what they say that it's haunted?
I think they might be.
It might be, really, see? Told you, boys.
It's much more a curiosity now, I think, as opposed to a fear. It was, people didn't really want to go in and find out the unknown that way. And they would never go, you know, like, come together in a group. You know, it's like having a seance or something, which we actually did.
When I came to Williamsburg, I started to hear these stories about ghosts in Williamsburg. And of course they came out of Dr. Goodwin's ramblings around town and how he would walk down Duke of Gloucester Street and commune with the people of the past. But the stories about the Wythe House began to sort of focus down, and that not just people of the past wandering the streets in his imagination, but 3 definite ghosts that were reported to have been seen or heard or whichever. And he never denied that they existed. When somebody like ourselves wrote to them and asked him to identify them, he said he wasn't prepared to do that, but you must come and witness it for yourself. So I thought, okay, well, let's go and witness it for ourselves.
Oh, well, that's all right.
Did somebody just hit a light switch? No, the light bulb just went.
If you're a rational person, you have to be slightly irrational to really get there and say, I'm going to see something, you know.
Was there somebody at the door?
Yeah, security officer. I had to unlock the door. As I'm going up the stairs, I see this light flickering in the room, you know?
Yeah.
It's like, okay.
Gee, I was hoping maybe
it was his flashlight.
Yeah,
coming
looking
in
to
the
see
window,
why.
and he was trying to see if there was anybody
in there. Yeah.
But there is some drama, some heart pounding when you sit there alone with a single candle, flickering, waiting for something to happen. And the longer you wait, the more eerie the building seems to become. You become increasingly aware of every creak and groan. And there were plenty of creaks and groans. Whether those were made from my photographer or not, I don't know.
There we go.
Dave had his photographic stuff set up downstairs. As he grew accustomed to the dark, he saw what appeared to be a glowing teapot on a shelf in the corner cupboard, and he thought we were really onto something then. But the more he looked at it, he also saw the tiny shaft of light coming from a hole in the shutters. So it was in fact a focused spotlight of moonlight hitting the teapot. And so the teapot was the only really dramatic moment. I went downstairs with my trusty flashlight, which didn't work, and we wondered why it didn't. And the curator who was with us the next morning, her car wouldn't start. Now, whether the ghosts have anything to do with that, I have absolutely no idea. But one tries, you see, to hang all these things together, to find links, even if they don't really exist. It makes for a good story, and that was really all we were trying to achieve. At 12:20 a.m. I wrote, "Time to pack up and leave the ghosts to their own amusements at our expense." And so we did. The next day, a lifelong resident of Williamsburg, now in her 80s, called to ask how we had fared in our vigil. When I confessed that nothing had happened, she said, "Of course not. You couldn't expect anything like that to happen to order, and certainly not with a photographer around. I know there are ghosts," she said. "You should try again, but do it on your own." I don't think so.